Hi, and welcome to part 3 of Garden Corner. I'm Karen Alari, and we're painting this little painting of some geraniums today. And we are into the section where we are building up our secondary flowers. We've worked already on our main focal point flower and got that pretty much where I wanted it. And now we're going to work on these other flowers in the painting. Something I'm thinking about when I'm doing this is that I don't want these other flowers to be any more intense than the focal point I've already set up, which is kind of the reason why I finished that focal point flower first, because I wanted to judge the level of detail and the intensity of color and all the other things that make that a focal point and not have any of the other flowers outshine that one. So now I'm just having fun. I'm looking at my reference photo and just looking for shapes of colors. I've talked about this many times in my other videos, but I'm just looking for a particular color and a particular shape and trying to lay it down fairly loosely. The color I'm using now is a light peachy color, and you can see I'm making it with Quinacridone Magenta and Cadmium Yellow Medium and some white. And again, as you can see, when you go lighter in color, you end up with a more dulled color. It's not quite so intense. But I know this little area of flowers to the right here are just more peachy. They're sunlit in the sun, and they're just lighter. So I'm trying to establish that value. And now I'm moving back into these flowers that are more the colors of the focal point flower. So I'm bringing back in those deep purple colors for the shadows, adding some white to that, and laying in some of those light sides of the flowers. Something I do as I'm editing out this video to make it easier to watch is I spend a good amount of time looking at the painting and seeing where I want to go and looking at my reference photo. You can see there I sprayed my paint with some of my little mister bottle. That's something you have to do as you're painting with acrylics, is every once in a while keep the paints moist and wet on your palette by giving a little spritz with your mister bottle. That's very handy. And again, as I find one of these colors, this is sort of a light magenta with some blue to it to make it more purple. I add a little bit of that in a number of different places on the painting. You don't want just put any particular color in just one spot on your painting. You want to integrate it throughout the painting. There I'm going into my Quinacridone red, which I don't normally have on my palette, but is a very clear, kind of a cool red. Very useful, I think, in this painting. Back to my cadmium yellow medium, and you can see how kind of dirty my cadmium yellow is getting from dipping my brush into it. And so you can see I'm very carefully trying to find a spot in the pile that's clean. You want to be aware of the fact that, you know, you need to keep your colors clean. So just have to be a little wary of that. Keeping my brush loose in my hand, rolling it along, trying to create some shapes that are just kind of natural, but I'm referring back often to my reference photo just to find a shape, just something to inform my brush stroke. One thing you can notice as I continue on my palette, I've been using this palette for a long time now. It's getting kind of messy, but one thing I do is I try to keep an area where I'm mixing color, the same type of color in that area. And if I'm going to mix something that's more orange, I'll move to a more orange pile. And over time when you're working with acrylic paints, those mixing areas will actually dry and you can mix an entirely other color on top of that and it won't mix into the paint you're using. But I do try to keep certain similar colors together as I'm mixing my palette and try to keep my mixing strokes small enough that the area is small enough that I don't just have a mess on my palette and no place to work. Coming back in with some darker colors. And again, one of the themes I'm using in this painting is when I'm in my darker areas, I'm also getting more chromatic. The colors are richer because I love those rich colors, but I want to also have a feeling of sunlight. So see there, I grabbed some white again to define my sunlit areas of these flowers. And if you look back at the reference photo, you can see that these two flowers, or these areas that I'm working on here, were very peachy and very sunlit and very light. So I'm trying to create that lightness but still keep some vibrant color. So that's why I'm choosing to, in the shadows, keep some deep color. And you see how that was very white color, that was getting lighter and more chalky. But the amazing thing about acrylics, especially when you use these quinacridone colors, you can come back in, and I put some quinacridone magenta back in there, and you can kind of clear them back up by doing that. Make the color more vibrant is what I guess I mean. Alright, so as we continue on with these flowers, adding a little quin red and cadmium yellow medium, and you can see I chose a completely different spot on my palette to try to come back and get that clear color again for the shadows. One thing that I'm doing as I go along is I'm using a natural bristle brush, and as you work with acrylics, you keep the brushes that you're not using soaking in your rinse water to keep the paint from drying in the brush. But after a while, as you use these natural brushes, and I like to use a natural bristle brush just because of the brush stroke it gives me, and it's not as hard-edged as a synthetic brush, and I will use the synthetics when I'm looking for a hard edge and trying to get something very distinct. But generally when I'm working with natural shapes, I like something a little softer, which the bristle brush is good for. But as it gets more waterlogged, basically paint logged in the process of painting with acrylic paints, it starts to lose its shape a little bit. So you'll see as I go along, I'm doing a lot more rolling of the brush to try to maintain its shape and the point so I can get a nice clear brush stroke. Working on this upper flower a little bit more, which I really like this flower, the way I like the design element of it going off the edge of the canvas. But just working on defining its shape. This is really the fun part for me. There are so many beautiful colors that are in these geranium flowers, and it's such a challenge to try to recreate them, just like a puzzle. And I love color itself, so I have a great deal of fun just mixing the colors and thinking to myself, oh no, this area needs to be a little more orange, a little more pink, a little lighter, a little darker. Adding some more white to that. I'm working on these sunlit sides here of these little geraniums. I'm trying to be careful here not to create quite as much detail as I did with my focal point flower, but still give enough because they're still in the area, the focal area, and they're going to kind of lead the eye. As I roll that brush gently establish one side that's more of a hard edge, and then roll and tap the brush to get that, strive to get anyway, that natural shape. And then I'll often come back, as I'm doing here. What I'm doing is softening up those inside edges. So I've created one hard edge, and I've talked about this before, but created one hard edge and then came in, rinsed my brush in water, and softened the edge with a damp brush on one side. So I have one lost edge and one found edge and one sharp edge. There's some more softening right there. Working in a lighter color and a little bit of a more dull color, and then adding back some of that cadmium yellow to it. The sunlit areas of these flowers in the reference photo were very bright yellow, which was kind of interesting. Sometimes you don't know if it's just the photograph that did that. Of course, I did paint these flowers out on location earlier in a different painting, so I have in my mind a good idea of what the colors actually were, as opposed to what the photograph is telling me. When you take that Quinacridone Magenta and the Cadmium Yellow, it gives you a nice pure color. There is actually a Cadmium Orange that I thought about using for this painting, but it's such a bright, almost unnatural orange that whenever I use it, I have a tendency to just dull it down anyway. And I find that if I take Quinacridone Magenta and Cadmium Yellow, I get a very similar color to what I would get otherwise. I did a small video on creating color cards in order to learn your colors. Just a way to take your paints and mix them with all the other paints that you use. And it's a wonderful exercise to understand the way your paints work, because each color has different properties. Some of them are more clear and bright, and some of them are duller and muddier. Some of them you can mix with 2 or 3 or 4 other colors, and they're still going to come through brightly, and others of them, they're just going to muddy up any mixture that you use them with. So, that's something that you learn at your palette. It's something that there's no better teacher than being at your easel and working with your palette and seeing what actually happens. So we're about done with part 3 here of our little painting, and I thank you for joining me, and I hope that I'm inspiring you to go out and paint the flowers in your garden. And we'll be moving on to part 4 and working on the foliage of these flowers and seeing if we can't finish this painting pretty quickly. Thanks for joining me.